In this clip, I'll demonstrate a method to sync your beloved vintage drum machines, such as the SP1200 here, using the SyncGen 3LX from InnerClock Systems. I'll be using Ableton Live, but this will work much the same with just about any DAW on the market, such as Logic, Cubase, Pro Tools, etc., etc. For best viewing, I recommend watching the clip on a laptop or larger display, such as a TV, etc. Put the clip in full screen mode and set the resolution to 1080p via the settings widget down on the bottom right. If you enjoy the clip, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and if you're needing sample packs ready to play in your sampler's native format, then check out the TONELAB store at store.tonelab.au. Last of all, those needing drum machine tuition or other studio services, personal one-on-one sessions are available. Check the description below for details. With that aside, at some point, many of us are faced with the age-old dilemma: what to do with your sequences and songs once you've completed them inside the SP1200 or maybe some other drum machine / sequencer. I'm presuming most of us would record the parts into a DAW so that we can then mix and arrange the tracks further. Which then begs the question, what's a faithful, efficient, and dependable way of doing that? Should you use MIDI so that your DAW can capture your sequences in time using the DAW's clock, or should we use SMPTE? Now, personally, I've never been overly impressed with the performance of MIDI sync because I feel something goes missing whenever I hear the SP1200 slave to an external MIDI clock. It just doesn't feel like it charges along with that gusto that it has when it's running on its own internal clock. So then, should we use SMPTE timecode? Well, personally, I don't mind SMPTE. It definitely feels better to me than MIDI does. However, SMPTE doesn't really adhere to the bars or grid of a DAW, nor does it support tempo changes, as it's a timecode-based signal that counts frames, seconds, minutes, and hours. So what else is there? Well, strangely enough, I stumbled upon this little nifty box from InnerClock Systems, which provides a special set of sync protocols that were common on drum machines, sequencers, and synthesizers back in the 70s and 80s. You could consider it a Swiss Army knife of sync options for your DAW. It's got Roland's DIN sync, MIDI sync, V-trigger, S-trigger, and PPQ clock sync, which is what I'll demonstrate here with the SP1200. And you could use it in much the same way to clock an Oberheim DX or DMX, Emulator 2, Lindrum, Fairlight, or a Roland 303, 606, 808, 909, or even use it to trigger a Mini Moog from the mid-70s. But the reason I found the 3LX so useful is because when I'm using it with the SP1200, the SP doesn't sound like it's being synced. It still sounds like I'm using it on its own internal clock, only it's actually locked in time with my DAW, and in such a way that I can continue working inside the SP1200 and record the SP's outputs directly into Ableton without having to do the old slice and dice or nudge the audio tracks back into place on the grid. And theoretically, I could potentially dump 16 or 24 tracks out of the SP over 2 or 3 passes, giving the impression that I've got 2 or 3 SP1200s. You're only really bound by the number of channel inputs on your audio interface, which if it's only 2 or 4, then no problem. Come back and do 2 at a time or 4 at a time. For the most part, it's set and forget, and it allows the SP to play and record alongside your DAW like a sidecar. Further to that, it gives me a workflow scenario where I can record a few SP outputs at a time, then delete those samples, sample something new, sequence those, then record those to new tracks in my DAW. And I can repeat that scenario as many times as I need to. It's almost as if I've got an unlimited supply of memory and channels on my SP1200, which, if you own one of these, you might agree that's quite a crazy concept. So let's check it out. It comes with instructions, adhesive sticker, power supply, and a MIDI test tube that glows on note activity and or tempo changes. A Y cable, which allows S or V triggering, and a MIDI extension connector. So it's quite a serious solution for anyone that relies on their DAW but owns a vintage drum machine or sequencer or more, which is probably why the Chemical Brothers have been seen touring with these for years. I'll quickly download and install the SyncGen companion plugin that comes in VST, AU or AAX format. And I should mention, you'll need an iLok account to register the plugin. I won't show you mine, but it's easy enough to get one via iLok.com. Once installed, rescan your plugin folder, locate the plugin. In my case, I'll use the AU and drop it onto an empty space where Ableton will create a new channel for me with the SyncGen plugin on it. And what the plugin does is generates an audible pulse based on the tempo of your DAW that the SyncGen box listens for. And because of this, we'll need to route that SyncGen pulse through an output on the audio interface used by your DAW. In my case, I'll choose output channel 33, as I know it's not currently being used. But you can use whatever output channel you have available. Next, we'll configure the physical SyncGen box so that it can translate that pulse coming from your DAW into a clocking language that the SP1200 understands. To do that, start by taking out the 4 side screws. Lift up the top panel, and inside you'll find some dip switches that will switch into place especially for use with the SP1200. I'll set the first tip switch left for V-trig, then I'll set the ring transport pulse right for S-trig, although I don't think this makes much difference with the SP's start-stop transport, as the start-stop port is specifically intended for use with a foot switch, but more on that later. I'll set the start switch to on, the stop switch to on, and then we're not merging this front input with any of the rear ports, so it doesn't really matter where these are for this configuration of sync. And last of all, let's connect it all up. First, we'll need a 1/4-inch TS jack to come out of your audio interface and into the SyncGen. For best results, use a good quality cable and not something scrappy that's hanging on by a thread. Connect whichever output you decided to use on your audio interface to the SyncGen's rear input labeled SG3. Connect the included Y cable to the rear pulse/trigger output, then connect a 1/4-inch TS jack into the Y cable's black input labeled tip. Take the other end of that and insert it into the SP's clock input jack. With another 1/4-inch TS jack, connect one end into the Y cable's red input labeled ring, and the other end into the SP's run-stop jack. From here, it's user discretion as to what you'd like to record from your SP into your DAW. But so you understand the test I'm about to conduct, I'll just take the SP's metronome output, route that into a channel on my audio interface, and take the signal from the SP's mix out and route that into another channel input also on my audio interface. Now let's quickly run through the SyncGen's front LEDs. Low indicates the unit is powered on. OK is to gauge the incoming plug-in signal and should remain lit during play. The O/L LED indicates that the plug-in level is too hot or overloading. So back the level off if you see this on. Once you've fine-tuned your levels and the SyncGen is happy, you're good to go. Now, in terms of the front dials here, I'll put some additional details in the description below, but copy the settings I have here for the SP1200. Then, in terms of the SP1200, enable the sync module, press number 4 for click sync, and then enter 04 on the keypad, and then enter twice. There's a deep dive here on the channel for the SP1200, which covers just about everything else you'll need to know. I'll leave the link in the description below. So let's head back to the DAW and get a sense of what the SyncGen's default setting looks and sounds like. I'll first record a few bars of the SP1200's metronome as audio. Okay, so by default, it looks a little behind the grid. So let's tighten it up by adjusting the SyncGen plugin's delay feature. Now let's capture that SP metronome again, but with the delay setting enabled. Okay, that's much better. Now we're sounding good and looking sharp. So ultimately, that's all good news. The only downside I've come across is that the start-stop mechanism needs a double tap to reset the SP's sequencer back to bar 1, which isn't really the end of the world. It's just a couple of extra clicks on the spacebar. And you can see the SP poised to play when the run light is on. Alternatively, you could use a dedicated start-stop foot switch if that's going to annoy you. The other thing worth mentioning is you'll need to hold down run and record to arm the SP sequencer for record, which is to be expected. So not major deal breakers really. The tight, stable sync still overshadows any extra clicks in my opinion. Another thing I should mention is each computer and DAW configuration will have its own unique delay requirement, so copying mine could make things worse. Instead, copy what I did earlier and record your SP's metronome until it's fairly aligned with the bars on your grid. The SP will move around slightly with each pass, but that's also the SP jitter at play too. So I recommend having 4 or 5 attempts at seeing where your metronome lands in relation to the grid measures. And use the second or third measure, aka bar markers, as your yardstick. Then finally, choose what you consider as middle ground from those 4 or 5 attempts. And you may need to adjust your sample buffer settings too. A lower setting will reduce your overall latency, but will put more pressure on your computer's CPU to make things happen quicker. Ultimately, you may need to adjust the buffer when recording versus when mixing or playing back. Alternatively, you could save your SyncGen plugin settings, one with a measured delay amount for recording versus one preset for mixing and playing back. If you're interested to learn more about the SyncGen or other products from InnerClock Systems, then browse innerclocksystems.com. Anyway, that's all for this clip. I hope that's helped. There's also deep dive tutorials here on the channel for many classic drum machines and synthesizers. If you found that useful, hit like, subscribe, and ding the bell for notifications. There's also shorter workflow tips and tricks over on the Quick Tips channel at TONELAB QT. So if you like this, you'll find more of that over there too. Thanks for watching and bye for now.